Let me tell you a story about my son, George, and the strange things that seemed to follow him wherever he went. George has always had a way of attracting the oddest friends. I'm not sure why, but even as a little boy, he was like a magnet for the kids others called weird. I've got plenty of stories about this, but there's one that sticks out like a thorn, and it happened when George was in the fourth grade, and it's a story I'll never forget. We had just moved to a new town because of my husband's job. It was a big change for all of us, but George seemed to handle it well. He was always an outgoing and friendly kid, so my husband and I weren't too worried about him making new friends. He was doing great at his new school, and everything seemed to be going smoothly. I even met the parents of his classmates, and they all seemed like nice, normal people. But as I would soon learn, not everything is as it seems. A few months after the move, I got a call from George's school in the middle of the day. The principal asked if one of us could come in to discuss an incident involving George and another student. My husband was at work, so I went. I remember feeling a mix of anger and confusion. Anger because I thought George might have been in a fight, and confusion because that wasn't like him at all. George wasn't the type to get into trouble. He was a good kid, respectful, kind, and well-behaved. So why was I being called to the principal's office? When I picked George up from his classroom, he was unusually quiet. Normally, he was a chatterbox, always eager to tell me everything about his day, but this time, he wouldn't say a word. I asked him what had happened, but he just stared at the ground, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I figured he was either embarrassed or scared, so I didn't push him too hard. Still, his silence made me uneasy. The principal asked George to wait outside while we talked. I sat down in front of the principal's desk, my heart pounding. He started by asking me questions about George, how he behaved at home, whether he listened, if he ever talked back. I told him the truth. George was a good kid. He always listened, always followed the rules. The principal nodded, but his expression was serious. Then he told me why I was there. Apparently, George had gotten into a fight with another student after recess. A boy named Sebastian. I was shocked. George? In a fight? It didn't make sense. I asked what had happened, and the principal explained. George and Sebastian had been the last two students outside, walking up the stairs together. Out of nowhere, George pulled an eraser out of his pocket and hit Sebastian with it. Not just a tap, a hard strike that left a mark. I couldn't believe it. An eraser? Why would George do something like that? And why was he carrying an eraser in his pocket? It didn't add up. The principal said Sebastian wasn't seriously hurt, but his parents were upset, and they wanted to make sure this kind of thing didn't happen again. I apologized and promised to talk to George about it. But as I left the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. George was still sitting in the waiting room, staring at the floor. I took him home, and as soon as we walked through the door, I sat him down and asked him to explain. At first, he refused to talk, but after some gentle prodding, he finally opened up, and what he told me sent chills down my spine. Sebastian isn't what you think, George said, his voice barely above a whisper. He's different. Different how? I asked. George hesitated, then said, he doesn't blink. Ever. And he talks to things that aren't there. I frowned. What do you mean he talks to things that aren't there? Like he talks to the air, George said. Like there's someone there, but no one is. And sometimes when he's talking, the lights flicker. It's like he's not really a kid. I didn't know what to say. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. But George wasn't the type to make things up. He was a practical, down-to-earth kid. If he said something was wrong with Sebastian, I believed him. But What could I do? I couldn't exactly go to the principal and say, my son thinks his classmate is a ghost. Still, I couldn't ignore it. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to George's behavior. He seemed more withdrawn than usual, and he often looked tired, like he wasn't sleeping well. When I asked him about it, he said he was having bad dreams about Sebastian. What kind of dreams? I asked. George hesitated. He's in my room, he said, just standing there, watching me, and he's saying things I don't understand. I didn't like the sound of that. I tried to reassure him, telling him it was just a dream, but deep down I was worried. Something wasn't right. A few days later, I got another call from the school. This time, it was George's teacher. She said George had been acting strangely in class, staring off into space, not paying attention, and sometimes whispering to himself. She asked if everything was okay at home. I told her it was, but I wasn't so sure anymore. That night, I decided to check on George before I went to bed. I opened his door quietly, not wanting to wake him if he was asleep. But he wasn't asleep. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, and he wasn't alone. Sebastian was there. I froze in the doorway, my heart pounding. Sebastian was sitting on the floor, his back to me. He was whispering something, but I couldn't make out the words. The room felt cold, and the air was heavy, like it was hard to breathe. I wanted to say something, to tell Sebastian to leave, but I couldn't find my voice. Then George turned and looked at me. His eyes were wide, filled with fear. "Mom," he whispered, "he's here." That's when Sebastian turned around, and I saw his face. His eyes were black, completely black, like two empty holes, and his mouth. It was stretched into a grin, but it wasn't a normal grin. It was too wide, too sharp, like it didn't belong on a child's face. I screamed. I couldn't help it. The sound seemed to snap Sebastian out of whatever trance he was in. He stood up, still grinning, and walked toward me. I backed away, pulling George with me. But Sebastian didn't follow us. He just stood there, watching us with those black eyes. Then he spoke. His voice was low and raspy, like it didn't belong to a child. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "Now you'll see." And with that, he was gone. Just gone. 1 second he was there, and the next, he wasn't. The room felt normal again, but I was shaking. George was crying, clinging to me, like he was afraid I'd disappear too. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but I knew one thing. Sebastian wasn't a normal kid. He wasn't a kid at all. The next day, I called the school and told them George wouldn't be coming back. I didn't give them a reason. What could I say? That my son's classmate was some kind of monster? They'd think I was crazy, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let George anywhere near that school or Sebastian ever again. We moved again a few months later. My husband didn't ask too many questions. He could tell something was wrong, but he didn't push. George seemed to get better. After that, he stopped having bad dreams, and he started making friends again, normal friends. But I'll never forget what happened, and I'll always wonder, so what was Sebastian, and why did he choose George? The mystery deepens, but the story doesn't end there. A year after we moved, I got a call from one of the parents from George's old school. She told me something that made my blood run cold. "You remember Sebastian, don't you?" she asked. "Of course," I said, my voice trembling. "Well, he's gone," she said. "Disappeared. No one knows where he went. But before he vanished, he left something behind. A note. It had your son's name on it. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me." "What did it say?" I asked. She hesitated. "It just said, 'I'll be back.'" And that's where the story ends, or at least where it pauses. Because even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that Sebastian is still out there, watching, waiting, and one day he'll come back for George. So, if you ever meet a boy who doesn't blink, who talks to things that aren't there, who makes the lights flicker when he's near, run. Run as fast as you can because you never know what he might be or what he might do.